With me is Arthur Goldstuck. He's the MD of Worldwide Works. Arthur, welcome to what we call Marketing Wars here on the Ashraf Garda show.
Thank you, Ashraf. Good to be chatting with you
Thank
again.
you. Now, are we talking specifically in the context of what the social media landscape 2020 report or presentation that was delivered a few days ago? I understand a combination put together by Ornico on the one hand and your company Worldwide Works. So that's why we're talking. Firstly, how important is this report? I mean, in terms of the reasons why this report is important, why is it important?
It's important because social media has become the new media, in effect, especially with print media being under such heavy pressure and not being able to cover as much as it could in the past and not being as available as it has been in the past. The traditional media, as well as emerging media, are turning to social platforms to share news and information. But along with that, these platforms have given the ordinary individual a platform, a voice, and a channel. So it's not only receiving news, but it's also participating in news, responding to news, and sharing their own information. But not just from a news point of view, also from a social point of view. These platforms have become most South Africans' first port of call when they want to express themselves or communicate with anyone else. Aside from direct one-to-one communication on instant messaging or by phone, for example, social media has become everyone's default communications platform. So it's important to understand what the trends are shaping it, what are the emerging platforms, how they are being used, and in particular by brands, we want to see the extent to which they are leveraging social platforms and which are working for them, which aren't, and why they're not working. That is probably a critical question, how to make these platforms work for you.
Absolutely.
And that applies to brands and consumers.
And the reporting, I mean, I've had a periscope view of it. It's fascinating, the numbers, but I mean, there's so much to come through, right? But here's the question. Is the report directed to the social media user, which are many in the world, as you've just mentioned, or is it in fact skewed for the understanding of marketers and brand managers?
It's very much a marketer's report. It's intended to give marketers the market intelligence they need to use social media effectively in South Africa. So their strategies will dictate how they practically and actively use it, but this kind of data and the insights in this report will provide them with the background and the data they need to justify how they use the platform.
Okay, great. So I'm probably going to run through, various social media platforms in a moment, but before we do that, perhaps your thoughts on the general overview of what was presented.
I think the most interesting thing that we saw was the extent to which Facebook has remained the default platform for most marketers and for most consumers, for that matter. So when we asked people in the biggest brands in South Africa, which platform do you use? 9 out of 10 said Facebook. Next highest was, so that was 89% to be exact. Next highest was Twitter at 77.5%, so well behind Facebook. Then came, interestingly enough, LinkedIn at 75%, just behind Twitter, and catching up very fast. LinkedIn's growth has been much more rapid than Twitter in the past year. The previous year, LinkedIn was on 73%, went up to 75%. Twitter had been on 83% and dropped to 77%. And then when we look at what they are going to do next, we see LinkedIn with 21% of brands saying that they plan to use it if they hadn't used it before. And that tells you that LinkedIn is going to shoot past Twitter in the coming year as a go-to platform for brands. Instagram, not far behind, on 68%, but they've also come down from 77%. And LinkedIn has overtaken Instagram, which is quite astonishing when you consider how Instagram gets all the media mileage and LinkedIn is seen as the serious platform. And then YouTube, quite far behind those. Only half of brands are using YouTube, literally 50%, dramatically down from well over 60%. But then when we ask what they're going to be using next, there was a very interesting name that cropped up that doesn't really appear at the moment, and that was TikTok. So last year, TikTok was used by about 20% of brands. So it didn't even appear on the radar of the most used brands in South Africa, or the most used platforms in South Africa. But in the coming year, an additional 31% intend to use it. And my suspicion is that once other brands become aware of just how powerful the platform is, even more will use it. Powerful in particular amongst the youth. So any brand that wants to target the youth is going to have to take to TikTok.
And just so that I understand the analysis correctly, this is a survey that was done and therefore responded to by custodians in this marketing and branding space, right? So you're asking them, A, whether they were using these platforms, and B, whether they were using it not just for personal use, but using it on behalf of brands that they represent. Have I got that right? I mean, this is not a survey of the general public, right?
That's correct, but the report does have several parts to it. The main part is our primary survey amongst the biggest brands in South Africa. More than 100 brands took part in the survey. And then in addition to that, we then analyzed each of the individual platforms' user numbers. And we also work with a few what they call social listening platforms to get their data. And we also collaborate with Ask Africa, who does the annual TGI survey of consumers, to get that consumer data. So there's a vast depths of consumer insights and data in the report, but the primary research in terms of the main findings were around how brands themselves are using social media in South Africa.
Let's then do some deep diving into some of the specifics then. So let's start with the TikTok, because you mentioned just how they're rising. And just for the record, no, I will not be attempting any dance sequence to one of your popular songs, so leave that out. What's the big appeal for TikTok, Arthur, in spite of my own concerns about it?
I think the initial big appeal was the whole idea that it's a network or a platform of your peers, and particularly for teenagers. And the fact that they could make videos so easily and upload them so easily made it very instant for them in terms of instant gratification. So call it the instantaneous platform, if you like, but you can do anything you like on it. Also, it's very undemanding. The videos last from 12 seconds to 60 seconds. So you don't have to sit and do a professional production of a 3-minute to 30-minute YouTube video, for example, where the pressure is really on. Yeah, it's very casual. And also, there is a tremendous appetite for this kind of content amongst the youth. The next really big appeal of it is that the youth find themselves with new role models and new stars that are only their stars and only their role models. They don't belong to the mainstream media. So when you look at characters, for example, like Shanae and Whitney H, who are two of the most popular South Africans on TikTok, they're utterly unknown outside of the TikTok world. They belong to TikTok, and therefore the TikTok users feel these are our stars. They're not stars that we've borrowed from mainstream media or from the hype of the media machine out there. This is inside. This is our little world. And these are our stars in our world.
And therefore, so here's the thing. The appeal of TikTok then, from a user point, is one thing. So the appeal then to brands, what would the appeal then be? What's in it for the brands?
Brands haven't quite worked it out yet. But one of my favorite case studies is Starbucks, which has been launching their new drinks in collaboration with the TikTok stars. And the way they do that is to invite the TikTok characters to their events. And I think initially it's all unpaid. It's just, we would like to host you, free drinks, a good party, meet up with your TikTok friends, etc. And that alone created massive hype around their involvement on TikTok. I think as it moves on, brands like that will have to pay these TikTok influencers, let's call them, to attend their events and to also post on TikTok about the events. But the obvious thing that happens is that you have tremendous sharing of images, videos, and the like from those events on TikTok, and therefore that amplifies the brand presence on TikTok quite dramatically, far beyond.
And I
what
take
the
it,
brand itself could do.
you're not going to get a breaking news story on TikTok. You're not going to have discussions around COVID-19. Meaning, it's fun. It's the type of escapism that people would love to yearn for on a weekend in normal times, isn't it?
Yes and no. In fact, TikTok is a massive channel for COVID-19 coverage. So when the crisis first began and when lockdown was about to start, pre-lockdown even, just in the social distancing period, you already had massive efforts by the stars and ordinary people of TikTok sharing videos about how to behave, what to do, etc. The first washing hands videos that I saw were actually on TikTok. And then TikTok has also been carrying breaking news from news channels as well. My own TikTok channel was created, in fact, to interview interesting people on TikTok in less than 60 seconds. And one of those was, in fact, two of them were the TikTok personalities I mentioned, Shanae and Whitney 8. And I was astonished to see the traction that those videos got. I think the interview with Shanae got more than 60,000 views, and with Whitney 8's more than 90,000 views. I actually check what the latest figures are. They keep going up. But I've never had such engagement and such viewership of content I've created and put online in any other platform. And this was early days for me. It was in the first few weeks.
Okay, we know to find you now. TikTok away, right? Let's then get the clock ticking to. Let's get to the old warhorse in this case, Facebook, and your point about how it appears to have longevity in spite of what others may think. So what are the insights that you can share from that?
So there are quite a few. The one key insight is that the social media brand decision makers, in other words, the marketers in the large organizations and with large brands, tend to stick with the platforms that they know. And that's why you see Facebook still remaining so popular and TikTok being so small at the moment. And when I say platforms they know, not just that they know how the platforms work, but that they actively use those platforms. And we tend to find that marketers don't use Twitter as actively as they use Facebook, because Facebook is in their personal lives. LinkedIn reflects their professional lives. They're all trying to make contacts on LinkedIn, probably to remain employable as well in the long term. Whereas Twitter, for many of them, is a threatening environment. And I think that's why they've pulled back from Twitter. Where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, is when you look at where they are spending most of their social media budget. And we asked that question in terms of which is your most important platform for allocating social media budget. And Facebook was way ahead of everyone else. 59%, close to 60% of respondents said that Facebook was the primary outlet for social media budget. And guess which one came second, Ashraf?
I'm going to now suggest, no, I was going to say LinkedIn, but I don't see much of that. Well, you tell me. I would have thought Instagram, because it was fast rising in the last couple of years, but things may have changed.
It's changed ever so slightly. In fact, it was LinkedIn.
So it has been,
but
yeah.
far behind. 15% of respondents said LinkedIn, and then came Instagram with 11% of respondents. So they actually changed positions. Last year, Instagram was second, and then LinkedIn. And Twitter remains unpopular as a primary source of spending market budgets, only 5%. And that was down from 8% last year. And the rest were negligible in terms of being a primary platform. So those are the three main ones, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. But watch LinkedIn. It's getting more and more traction. I think also as the content on LinkedIn becomes more compellable and more shareable and more, call it, reactable, because now there's a range of reactions that you can give a LinkedIn post. I think you'll see LinkedIn rising even more rapidly.
I think just my personal point with myself and LinkedIn, I mean, there was a period when I hardly used it. It was just there. It's like showcasing if you're looking for a job. But I personally see it now as an active brand building exercise, personal brand building, and for my podcast and YouTube. So yeah, I think if others are thinking the way I'm thinking, then they're probably going to use LinkedIn and take it a lot more seriously. But let's just stay with the LinkedIn one. What I don't see, because what you're telling me is 15% of the spend is going to LinkedIn. Now why would marketers want to spend money there to target who? Because if the masses are playing in Facebook, and I would still assume the Instagram space, I don't hear people talk about LinkedIn the way they talk about Instagram.
I'll give you an example from my own experience. I'm doing a series of webinars with a niche bank called Sasfin, and they are using both LinkedIn and Twitter to market the webinars. And they get good response on Twitter, which surprised me. I expected far less of a response because of the serious brand that they represent. But LinkedIn is where they get all their action, massive amounts of sharing, liking, and the like, both before the event, during the event, and then afterwards as well, people responding to it. That has been the most successful marketing environment. So you can see why brands like that would prefer to use LinkedIn to any of the other platforms.
Okay, and just stay with the Facebook point of view. Your numbers are there. I understand that, but there was a period where the sense that Facebook's getting too old, right? So younger people are going to Instagram, and now you bring up TikTok. So why do you think Facebook has been able to retain that massive audience in spite of the naysayers before?
There's a few reasons. The naysayers tend to look only at a snapshot of what's happening right now. And we find that, generally speaking, with analysts, in a very similar way to which stock market analysts or currency analysts will look at what happened in the last 24 hours, and they'll extrapolate that to being the long-term picture. So if you look at the stock market, for example, in the USA, where it's, I think NASDAQ just reached its highest ever point. Just before the COVID-19 crash, when it crashed quite far, it was on its way to that highest point. When it crashed, it looked like a dramatic crash, and all the analysts analyzed it from that point of view. But if they took it on a 12-month basis, it was still significantly higher than it had been 12 months before. So that would have told them that in the long term, this wasn't truly a crash in terms of a long-term trend line. And you find the same thing with Facebook. They look at happening right now was that the proportion of teenagers joining Facebook under 18s was falling significantly. And the proportion of the overall Facebook user base made up by the under 18s was also dropping dramatically. But in the overall, Facebook as a whole was still growing. But these observers were not actually looking at the bigger picture and the longer term picture. They were just looking at that little niche area, or that little slice, that little snapshot of Facebook's activity, and saying this is the end for Facebook, which was clearly absurd. We called it out last year as well when those kind of comments were being made. Facebook is still by far the biggest social platform in the world and still growing. So despite all its debacles, despite all its public relations disasters and blunders, it continues to grow. And for that reason, it's still going to continue to be the one used the most by social media professionals at the big brands, and therefore they'll continue allocating budget to that platform.
Okay, let's touch on Instagram then. So I've said earlier on that my understanding was a couple of years ago it was just an incredibly fast riser for a fairly newish platform, right? But you telling me now that in fact that rise is not just slowed, but the usage has dropped off in South Africa. Give me those numbers again and tell me why.
It's not that usage has dropped off. It's that Instagram has been overtaken by LinkedIn as a primary source of spending marketing budget. When you look at the user numbers, they've grown dramatically. In fact, Instagram and Twitter are neck and neck, a total of around 9 million users on each platform, and each of them has around 4.7 million highly active users. That represents 19% of the South African living in cities and towns. That's massive, 1 in 5 using Instagram. And where you see the impact of that penetration is when we ask the brands where they are going to increase their spend on live streaming, in terms of using social networks for live events, live video, and the like. And there, Facebook still comes up number one. 43% said yes. But what's number two? Instagram, 29%. So specifically for live streaming, Instagram is the fast rising platform. The year before, Instagram was at 21%. Facebook was at 42%. So Facebook went up by 1%. Instagram went up by 8%. And that tells you then that Instagram is still very powerful for specific purposes. So IGTV, Instagram TV, has been a huge success story for Instagram.
And that live concept, I understand that during COVID-19, well, and I know it even now, just about everybody was like let's do a live chat. Why do you think, which is certainly not part of the normal Instagram plan, I would think, right? What is your understanding of why has it become that popular for live, whereas I don't think anybody besides organizations would say, let's have a live Twitter chat, for example, even news people?
I'm not aware of anyone who uses Twitter as their primary outlet for live broadcasting. So everyone is looking for the most effective platform for live events. And that's aside from the webinar platforms like Zoom and Teams. But in terms of marrying live streaming with social media, there's really only 3 games in town. That's Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. With YouTube, it's cheaper and you can get a much bigger audience, but it's a lot more difficult. It's complex. With Instagram, it's incredibly easy. And as I was saying about TikTok earlier, it's almost a case of just switching on your phone cam and you're live. And you don't get that sense with Facebook live events or YouTube live events where you feel you have to produce the event. A lot more production value has to go into those platforms, whereas Instagram and TikTok are instant.
And I'm thinking about a shopping mall. One thing is people shop to shop, but they also shop to see who else is shopping there. And do I take it that Instagram in particular is like a celebrity shopping mall? So if you're on Instagram, you'll see all these celebrity shoppers walking past you.
That's a great way of describing it. And I think that's one of the appeals of a lot of these social platforms. Same applies to YouTube and Facebook is on the event as well. And you can actually banter with each other, which you can't do on Twitter, for instance. So the engagement on a Twitter event is very limited. All the others are looking for ways of enhancing engagement. So that's where Twitter still has a long way to go to catch up.
And with Instagram, you mentioned IGTV Live, and I certainly have used it, and I probably will use it even more so. But the other one is Instagram Stories, and then Facebook Stories, of course, owned by the same company. There was a sense about a year ago that I've heard that, in fact, Stories will take over even the main feed. I mean, did that come through in your survey?
No, not at all. I think Stories is too difficult to almost pin down, you could say. Stories have to be experienced live or as they happen, and that means that they don't have long-term traction, whereas all the other methods do have long-term traction, particularly if you're recording live events and making them available on an ongoing basis after the event is over. So that tends to beat the one-off live experience.
Okay, what do you pick up from YouTube?
YouTube is losing a lot of favor, and I think one of the reasons for that is that they keep changing the rules and they don't treat their creator community very well, and they don't respect the small creator, for example, and they have too much respect for the big creators. So they've been called out regularly on their blunders that they've made, and among other things, not being child-friendly or putting down when it's either too late or excessively when it's not necessary. That's one side of it. And then another side of it is allowing violent content or content that promotes violence, content that promotes misinformation, almost abuse. If you look at the kind of right-wing conspiracy theory-oriented sites that claim that events like Sandy Hook were fabricated and used crisis actors, which was incredibly harmful to the families of the victims. And yet, it took a long time for YouTube to actually act on that kind of content. It was actually disgraceful behavior on the part of YouTube. And I think it's come back to bite them in a way that Facebook tends to have survived, because Facebook is where people socialize as well. YouTube is purely where people consume information, aside from the creators themselves. So advertisers are associating their messages with whatever content is most popular on YouTube, and suddenly they find themselves, in effect, funding the abusers on YouTube. And I think that's been massive for YouTube. Unfortunately, Google's revenue still keeps going up from advertising because they're the only game in town in certain respects. But YouTube certainly needs to clean up its act, both in terms of its content, which to some extent it has, but also the way it treats its small. Just as an example, if you're a creator on YouTube, you can't monetize your videos now unless you have 1,000. Getting a free long tail, the long tail being all the little players who don't appear on the radar as big providers of traffic. But when you add them all up, it's a massive proportion of YouTube traffic, and they're not having to pay a single cent for the traffic that they generate.
And the flip side of that, of course, talking about big players with Joe Rogan now moving on to Spotify alone, out of YouTube, that is another discussion that one would have to take a closer look at, right? Two things before I let you go, then, Arthur. The one is, in terms of the results of the survey, does it come through that people use multiple platforms? So an Arthur Goldstuck can be on Twitter, can be on Instagram, can be on LinkedIn, is on TikTok now that I know, and Facebook, and that reflects when people try and target you, that you are using multiple platforms, or do they make the assumption that in fact your favorite platform is the only one they're interested in?
Now, you do find that there's massive cross-pollination. So if you look at the most popular Instagram personalities, for example, they include people like Boiti and Minnie Dlamini and Bonang Mateba and Casper Nieuwest and Pearl Tuzi, as well as A.B. de Villiers, the cricketer. And those also happen to be among the most popular on Twitter, for example. Also on any of the other platforms you like those trends is TikTok, which has its own stars. But the fans of these individuals tend to follow them across the platforms, and they promote each of their other platforms on the platform that you're on at the moment.
Now, I've used an example of to people who are outside the social media space that, in fact, think of each one as a country. But unlike the YouTube, the Facebook example of how big that country called Facebook is, that each country in this case here, they're all human beings, they all speak a language, but they speak a different language. So for you to play in that space as a user and as a marketer and perhaps as an influencer, you need to know that language. I mean, does that hold true for you?
And that's very true. And the really big stars in each of the platforms tend to understand that as well. They actually have teams that manage their social media presence. So they'll tailor the message for each of those platforms. And they'll make sure that what works on Twitter is not necessarily what works on Instagram, so they'll create a different message. So Twitter will have more explanation or more text, whereas Instagram will have more visual emphasis, for example. And TikTok will have more of a video emphasis, or YouTube, for that matter, will have more of a video emphasis. And that is well understood. But there are a lot of people who simply, so you've come across it yourself on Twitter, the individual who every second post is a link to an Instagram post. What they've done is simply automatically automatically linked Instagram to Twitter. So that every time they post on Instagram, it posts that link to Twitter as well. And that's just poor use of the platform. It's also mindless use of the platform, but it's very common.
Okay, so let's conclude that by asking you, from high brow position, what is it that we should then finally take out from all of this?
I think the big takeout is that marketers shouldn't just stick to the platform they know, or if they want to stick to the platform that they know and that they use, then it's incumbent on them to use more platforms. So they need to get stuck into each of the platforms and use them actively. It doesn't matter if they don't like it. That's not actually their prerogative. They are a marketer. They are there to amplify the brand message, not to amplify their own preferences in terms of social media. And I think that's the biggest drawback for many brands, is when their brand custodian on social media has got those kinds of prejudices. This isn't an environment for platform prejudice. It's an environment for learning what works best on each platform, and you only do that by using the platform. So get out there and use the platform.
And Arthur, just to wrap up then, this concept of an owner of an account on any of these social media platforms, in fact, being an owner of digital real estate and therefore for sale, as in influencers. What came through out of that in terms of where influencers are, micro and major, and where's it going to?
We asked that question if the brand paid influencers. And it was very interesting to see that the proportion actually dropped significantly from last year. So last year, more than a third of brands, 35%, were using paid influencers. This year, that dropped to 29%. So you can see the concept is falling out of favor. But then we also asked them, do you know who the most influential people are in your social media communities? And that also dropped. So last year, that was 63%, which is very high. It dropped to 58%. So it seems like a small drop, but it's almost exactly the same drop in percentage terms as those who are using paid social media influencers. But probably the most interesting set of stats there is that the percentage that use paid influencers is exactly half of the percentage of those who know who their most influential people are. So by knowing who your most influential people are, you can engage with them without having to pay them for trying to get your brand amplified.
Okay, I know the hashtag for this is what? Hashtag social SA 2020. But where can people find all this information with a lot more detail if they choose to?
If they go to the World Wide Works website, the first story on the site, worldwideworks.com, and works is with an X, WORX, worldwideworks.com. The first story is the headline findings of the research. If they click on that link and they go to the bottom of the story, there's a form they can fill in to download the report for free.
Okay, well, man of influence, Arthur Goldstuck, thanks for your time. Most appreciated, and thanks for joining me here on Marketing Wars.